Well, in our country, we often pride ourselves on our work, don't we? It's a proud thing for us to say made in America, right? For many of us, that means a stamp of quality. That means something that was made with our own hands that we can support. And usually it means done in a very good way. And some of that kind of mentality that we have as being proud of our work harkens back, even in Christian history, in America and beyond, to what's called the Protestant work ethic. Have you ever heard of that before? Something that arose out of the Reformation, which we talked about briefly last week. But essentially, that kind of concept that is now seeped into most of American mindsets is that the beauty and goodness of work is something that God has given to us. Work is not inherently a bad thing, not something to curse us. It is something that we are meant to do, to use the gifts that God has given us to do good in the world. And so working hard is a part of our responsibility for God, the Protestant work ethic would say, and so we do it to the best of our ability. But sometimes that work ethic, this pride in our own ability, can make it difficult for us to be served by others. Have you ever felt awkward when someone goes above and beyond themselves to do something good for you? Have you ever, when someone does something like that in your life, go, oh gosh, you don't have to do that. And then the person has to do something like, I know I don't have to. I want to do it for you. I know I've had times where someone's been extremely kind to us and you can feel a little awkward, like, oh, you shouldn't have, but they're doing something good for you. When that mentality crosses into our view of God and how we relate to Him, it means we can be very, very comfortable with the idea of us serving God. Indeed, one of the ways it can be described to be a follower of Jesus is to be a servant of God. However, there are ways in which God tells us in the Scriptures we cannot serve God. In fact, that we're incapable of serving Him. There are ways, because of our sin, because of our brokenness, because of God's ultimate hugeness and greatness, that we cannot actually serve Him in every single situation. The Apostle Paul makes this clear when he is sharing the good news with the people of Athens in Acts chapter 17. He says this along the way in telling them what the good news of Jesus is. In 17 verse 24, he says, "The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands." See that? He's not served by human hands, as though he needed anything from us, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. God is great and sufficiently happy in himself, Paul says here. He made everything, including the molecules that make up your entire body. So why would you act as if he needs you, or he's deficient in some way to need your service? Why would that God need us? Into that reality, Jesus comes to earth as a God who on the night before his crucifixion stoops down and washes his disciples' feet. He serves them the night before he goes to the cross. Jesus, in this scripture again, is revealed as a God who serves us, which was a completely unknown concept in the ancient world, and even, I'd argue, sometimes in our world today. So let's see how this works out in the life of Peter and the life of John in this scripture. The key takeaway today, I write it on the back if you want to know and take that away for you, but the key takeaway, I'll put it up here, is that the risen Jesus continues to serve us and restore us through our failures, so we follow him in freedom. Let's see how this works out. Let's start by seeing what I'm going to call the God who serves us brunch. Let's see the God who serves us brunch. We love brunch in LA, don't we? Have you ever tried to go to Jones on 3rd on the weekend, or Aroma on the weekend, or any other significant, cafe or brunch place? We had family come in one weekend that were from out of town. I said, it's Saturday morning, let's go to brunch. And we drove by Jones and then laughed at ourselves. Like, what were we thinking? Because the line is fully outside the door. Everyone in LA loves brunch. Well, here, this is a way to share the good news in LA, right? Jesus is the God who serves us brunch. All kidding aside, this is one detail. This whole section has tons of beautiful details. This comes right after the account of doubting Thomas that we saw last week. If you weren't here, go on our YouTube page or on SoundCloud, and you can search Anthology Church and find that message. Thomas, after Jesus reveals the evidence to him, shouts, "My Lord and my God," and this section comes directly after that. John tells us the disciples had gone up north into the northern region of Israel, Galilee, where they were from. It's kind of the blue-collar area, the hardworking area of Israel. Probably not done in disobedience. Some people kind of think, well, were they running away from, what Jesus had called them to? No, probably not. There are other sections where Jesus says, go ahead to Galilee and I will meet you there. And we have this encounter that John tells us where Peter says, I'm going to go fishing. And the other disciples go, okay, let's go fishing too. It's a little strange, isn't it, though, that Jesus has risen. He's done this incredible miracle, this history-changing, altering miracle in all of the universe, and the disciples appear to be going back to what they were doing before. Most of them were fishermen beforehand, and now they're kind of going back into their old pattern. Again, we're going to see soon, when we get to the book of Acts, how this radically changes once the gift of the Holy Spirit is given to them. But it seems at this time, it's a little strange. They're in kind of this holding pattern, going back to what they're doing. So they go fishing. John tells us they spend all night fishing. Anyone gone fishing all night? That sounds like my nightmare. So don't want to do that. No offense to those who love fishing. But they go fishing all night. They catch nothing. Expert fishermen getting nothing. And all of a sudden, John says, Jesus shows up not too far away on the shore. Far away enough, they don't recognize him. Probably not one of those situations where Jesus was not revealing himself. He was just too far away. He asked them, children, do you have any fish? Which in our own slang language would probably be something like, hey, fellas, you catch anything tonight? And then they respond, no. And if you go fishing a lot, it's not an uncommon thing to hear, hey, why don't you, that side over there, the right side of the boat, good stuff there. Why don't you try that? So Jesus tells them that. They go for it, still not knowing it's Jesus, and they get overwhelmed by the haul that they bring in. And then this whole rest of the section revolves really around John and Peter. John, if you're confused here, refers to himself as the disciple who Jesus loved, or the beloved disciple, probably because of the particularly special relationship he had with Jesus, and that by this point was probably the way John became known. So he's referring to himself seems a little like John's kind of puffing himself up, the disciple whom Jesus loved. But he probably became known that way, and he's probably not trying to refer himself. It's more of a humble act instead of directly calling himself. But John realizes it's Jesus. They'd seen Jesus do miracles like this before when they're fishing, and as soon as he turns to Peter and says that, Peter grabs whatever outside garment he has, and this is just what you got to love Peter, right? He throws himself into the water and starts swimming towards the shore because he's excited to see Jesus. And so we are getting here. They start to get on the shore. They realize it's Jesus. Peter doesn't care. I think sometimes we're the rest of the disciples going, oh, Peter, really, we got to haul in all these fish now, and you come leaping off the boat, and it's really heavy here, and you just got to go. Anyway, I laugh at some of what goes on with Peter and the other disciples. But we are getting close here to Jesus giving his mission to his disciples. In fact, we saw that a couple weeks ago. He's sending them out to change the world with the good news. So here's another encounter with Jesus. What is he going to tell them right here? Jesus knows they're going to go through incredible things, incredibly hard things. Some of them will die. Some of them will be persecuted severely in prison. They're going to be leading thousands of people. What is Jesus going to do in this moment, in this huge strategic moment? He's going to serve them breakfast. He's going to make them brunch. He sits down, says there's a fire ready to go. He says, fellas, let's eat. So what is going on here? Why does John record this for us? Well, remember, these are expert fishermen, right? They are professional fishermen. You ever watch Deadliest Catch on Discovery Channel? The crazy people who go getting those crabs out in the coldest water ever. Again, my nightmare or something. But those are professional guys who have brought it down to a science. They know where to catch the fish or the crab in that instance. So are these disciples. And yet, they try all night and they can't catch anything. And then Jesus shows up and in an instant produces 153 fish. This is one final lesson for Jesus' disciples, that it is not them who is going to primarily be serving God, but it is God who serves them. Jesus is the God who constantly serves us. Why? Because if God serves us, if it's not us primarily doing everything we can for him, but it's him sustaining us, keeping us, serving us, comforting us, then who's the one that gets the glory and honor in that relationship? If it's God who serves us, then salvation, our being rescued, is fully of grace, a gift. Jesus continued to serve his disciples and serves us today so that he will never be in debt to us, and we will always be in debt to him. Look, if somehow in our service to God and our obedience to God, we could somehow earn our standing with him, or earn a better standing with him than we currently have, or earn a better standing than the other guy or girl next to us. If we could somehow do that, eventually, in some way, we would be able to boast in ourselves, right? We would be able to say, well, I've done so great at obeying these days. God must be so proud of me. And look, I'm totally better than Joe or Jane Christian over here. So in some way, we would be able to boast before God or before others. But if we can never outserve God, if all of our service is based completely upon him continuing to sustain us, encourage us, fill us, give us grace, press his love down into our hearts again and again, and then we respond in service, if Jesus is the God who serves us and works for our good, then we are forever in debt to him. And if we are forever in debt to him, then salvation is always and only all of grace and all due to him, not to us. And the scriptures say it's actually continually our growth as well. That's a result of his grace. Any good that we do in the world, if we're able to pray and change things, if we're able to love people, if we're able to share the good news, we're able to do good for orphans and all the other good things that we are able to do and try to do in here. If God continually serves us, it's not because we've somehow figured out the spiritual keys to the kingdom. And somehow we finally found the secret that other people don't have. But it's because we're simply responding to the incredible, unending, infinite grace he gives to us. And we're just trying to live in light of what he's done for us. Think about this. If you take a cup in your hand and you fill it up with water, and then you stick it under a waterfall, and then what happens to the cup? The water just, big waterfall coming down, huge amounts of water, and you have your cup here. What's coming out of the cup? Lots of water, right? It's so filled, it's just overflowing. If you go, wow, look at the capacity of my cup, you'd go, I don't think the capacity of the cup is what we should really be marveling at here. It's the waterfall that's flowing out that's doing all the difference. The waterfall is the thing that's producing all the amazing water coming out of that cup. It's our little cup we're holding out. That's what God's grace is. The water coming out, the Spirit coming out, what God has done doesn't reflect well on our capacity primarily, but reflects on the infinite supply of grace coming from God. This is the last lesson Jesus is giving to his disciples before he ascends back to the Father. He reminds them it's his work, it's his grace, it's his service, it is his miracle, it is his power that is going to carry them after his resurrection and after he ascends back to the Father, not themselves. And the same is true for us today. He does that by serving them brunch in the morning. I wonder how good a cook he was, by the way. Probably some pretty good fish, I imagine. Second, he's the God who serves us. He's the God who restores us. As the meal continues, we come to a famous conversation. If you've grown up in churches or you've been around different Christian communities for a while, this was probably a familiar story to you. If not, it can be a confusing one. Let me tell you, there's a lot of ink that's been spilled on this. A lot of words and sermons have been shared about what all this means, why 3 times. People get into the original language, into the Greek, because John uses 2 different types of words to mean love, and people kind of do all this crazy, this is what that means. The big point here, you can miss the clear picture of what's going on. Jesus is in the act of restoring Peter. That's the big picture. If you're familiar, remember, we've spent a while in the Gospels. We've seen Peter for a while now. We didn't look in depth at him. But if you remember, who was Peter before the resurrection? He often put his foot into his mouth, didn't he? I love Peter. You got to love him. He is that guy who continually does things that you go, really? When Jesus asked who people said he was, Jesus responded with, "You're the Christ, the Son of God, the one God has sent." And then moments later, Jesus says, "That's right, and I'm going to be handed over to the chief priests, and I'm going to suffer and die, and on the 3rd day I'll rise again." Peter's response, no. May it never be. That is not going to happen. No way. That is not the way my Messiah is going to come. And Jesus has to say a very harsh word to him. "Get behind me, Satan," if you're familiar with that passage. When Jesus was arrested, Peter pulls out a sword. Says it's time to start fighting. He cuts off a Roman soldier's ear. And Jesus again has to rebuke him and say, if you live by the sword, you will die by the sword, as he heals the Roman's ear. He says that is not the way the kingdom is going to advance, Peter. Then, of course, Jesus predicted Peter would deny him 3 times, right? Before the rooster crows. Something Peter immediately after that vigorously denied. "I will never deny you, Jesus." But sure enough, 1, 2, 3 times, Peter denies Jesus strongly after Jesus is arrested. And if you remember that section in the Gospels, you may remember Jesus looked immediately at him after the 3rd time. And it says Peter went away and wept bitterly after he had done that. So what then is Jesus doing here after the resurrection? Look how Jesus asked Peter 3 times, right? "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Each time Peter answers him back. Jesus responds each time with a form of his pastoral calling, what he is called to do as a leader and a shepherd, as a pastor of this new church. He says, "Feed my lambs, tend my lambs, feed my sheep." 3 different ways of saying essentially the same thing. The first time, if you notice, Jesus says, "Do you love me, Peter, more than these?" Most likely that's a reference Jesus is making to the other disciples that are there before him. Why would Jesus ask that? "Peter, do you love me more than these?" How would the old Peter have responded to that? Yes, Jesus, I love you more than all of them. I'm going to be the head. I'll take the lead. Here we go. You and me, Jesus, I love you more than all those other guys. Probably something like that would have been Peter's previous response. But how does Peter respond this time? He used to have rash confidence in himself, his own abilities, his own strength. How does he respond now, post-resurrection? Peter here is broken, right? He denied Jesus 3 times. In terms of a sin that is not doing direct harm to someone else, it's probably hard to get a lot worse than this, right? Denying Jesus, not 1, 2, but 3 times immediately after Jesus was arrested. Peter does not trust himself anymore. So what does he say? Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Who does Peter appeal to now? Himself, his own strength, his own abilities? No, this time he appeals 3 times to Jesus' knowledge, to what Jesus knows about him. Jesus, yes, I love you, but look, you're the one that knows everything. You know I love you. It's about you, not me. He is broken. He is despairing of himself. He is desperate for Jesus. That is Peter now. And do you know what? That's exactly the type of person God uses in his kingdom. We tend to think a lot of times being extremely self-confident, being strong in personality, being really assertive and a go-getter, being proud and you won't back down to other people. We tend to think that's probably the type of person that gets things done in this world. And oftentimes it actually is. But that's not true for what matters in God's kingdom. And that's not true of what's going to matter in eternity. That is not how God gets things done. Do you think that you're too weak to be used by God? Do you think you're too much of a nobody? You don't know the things that I've done? Do you think you're too much of a failure that God could ever do great things through you? Look at Peter. He was a huge failure. He made one of the biggest mistakes, sins in all of history. And he was broken to get to a place where he said, finally, it's not about me, I can't do it. And that's exactly when God was ready to use him. And Peter finally gets it. And so now he is perfectly in a place for Jesus to restore him. So, why does Jesus ask him 3 times, essentially the same question? How many times did Peter deny Jesus? 3 times. He is restoring him. Why does he do it publicly? This kind of is like, Jesus, did you have to do this in front of all the other guys? Couldn't you pull Peter aside and had this little chat and then, work it out and then come back and go, Peter's okay now and follow him. He does it in front of everyone. Why? His denials were public in front of everyone else. And so Jesus is restoring Peter publicly before the other disciples. He is putting him back into his leadership position before all the other disciples here to the place where he should be. Let me share with you another example of the way Jesus restores us when we truly understand who we are and understand what he has done. Last week, you remember we celebrated briefly and mentioned it was the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, started by a German monk, a guy named Martin Luther. Luther has become a hero for many Christians, many Protestants, of course. He stood up and spoke truth to power at the time because he essentially rediscovered the truth of the Bible, that salvation's all of grace. It's all by what God has done, not by us. It's all through Jesus, not by us. It's only by faith and by trusting him, not by our works and how good we are. But Luther didn't start out that way. In fact, as a young man, when Luther was 21, he decided to become a monk. And so a lot of people go, oh, that's really nice. He probably wanted to do a lot of good and change the world. Well, the truth is, Luther didn't do it out of gratitude to God. He wrote down some of these things. He became a monk because he was terribly frightened at the state of his soul. And he was convinced the only way that God will remotely, potentially forgive me and save me is if I get really, really holy. And the holiest I know how to get is to become a monk and to sit around by myself and do nothing but meditate all day. He saw God as a severe judge. And so when he saw his own brokenness and his own sin, he became overwhelmed, and he writes these agonizing pages of fear of being damned and going apart from God forever and ever. The breakthrough for Luther finally came when he was teaching Romans 1 at a college that he was at. So isn't it funny? As he was a teacher, it was his own breakthrough as he was studying. So Paul says this in Romans chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. This was the breakthrough for Luther. Paul says, "I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it's the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from our own works, our own goodness, our own ability to be really, really holy before God. No, from faith for faith. As is written, the righteous shall live by faith." Luther had always seen the righteousness of God as a horrible thing because he saw himself as so sinful, and rightly so, he was. So he said, I could never measure up. But Paul here said, righteousness comes by faith. That is, when you put your trust in Jesus, God gives you Jesus' very righteousness to you as a gift. So it's not your holiness and your ability, it's his that you receive. This changed everything for Luther. Here's what Luther writes about that. "I felt that I had been born anew and that the gates of heaven had been opened. The whole of Scripture gained a new meaning. And from that point on, the phrase, the justice of God, no longer filled me with hatred, but rather became unspeakably sweet by the virtue of a great love." For Luther, like Peter, when he realized that he was nothing, that he had no hope within himself to save himself or change himself, that he was lost in his own moral and spiritual efforts, but that Jesus, by grace, had done it all, then he was ready to be used by God for great things. This is the restoring power of the gospel that came into his life, that came into Peter's life here. And everything for Luther that was once dreadful and horrible became beautiful to him. And this is how Jesus treats us today. That is how Jesus, if you're a follower of him, restores you today. The work he wants to do in your heart day after day after day is when you fail, when you sin, when you turn from him, even as his follower, he does two things. He reminds us that apart from him, we have no hope, that we really can't change ourselves, that we really can't save ourselves, that indeed we're not as great as we thought we were sometimes. And second, he reminds us he's given us everything. His righteousness is ours. We are his adopted son or daughter. He will never leave us. We are forgiven fully. We are saved fully. He will come back one day. It's not about our performance. It's about what he has done for us. He reminds us it's not because of our goodness that we're saved, but because of his greatness. He restores us in this way. This is what is meant to be our spiritual food that we feed on day after day after day. This is where we look to for joy. This is what should give us freedom from I have to I get to serve and honor God. He does all the work. We get all the benefits. So the risen King serves us, he restores us through our failures, and then he frees us to follow him. Let's close quickly looking at the final parts of this. The final point we see today, Jesus restores Peter, and then he calls him to follow him. In verse 18, Jesus tells Peter immediately after this, truly, truly, what's going to happen? You'll go someday where your arms will be spread out. You'll go where you don't want to go. This was a prophecy for Peter specifically, not for every Christian. Jesus was telling Peter essentially he is going to die a martyr's death. And tradition holds that Peter was actually crucified in Rome sometime around the mid-60s AD, about 30 years or so after Jesus died and rose. It's amazing that with this prophecy, in fact, John confirms that this is how he was going to die. Isn't it amazing? He spent 30 years doing fruitful, amazing ministry for God, knowing someday Jesus said, you're going to die a martyr's death. And surely he did. And then he made that same call to Peter that he gave him the very first day Jesus met Peter and said, follow me. Right after that verse, in verse 21, Peter asked Jesus, hey, if that's what's going to happen to me, what about this guy over here? What about John? What about him? You see what Jesus tells him? If it's my will that he remain, what is that to you? Essentially, Peter, it's none of your business what I'm going to do with him. You follow me. If you trust Jesus, if you've put your hope in him, he serves you today. He sustains you today. He gives you his grace today. He wants to remind you of his love today. He restores you through your failures today, reminds you of who he is, brings you back to himself, speaks to you through the Bible, reminds you you can't do it on your own. And then he tells you every day, follow me, no matter where I take you. Jesus had a specific calling for John and for Peter. For Peter, he's going to have a really fruitful ministry, and one day he'll die as a martyr and bring glory to me that way. For John, it was different. John's calling was to come to a really old age. This is probably written about 20 years after Peter himself had died, more or less. And so John lived to an old age and then wrote this fourth gospel here so we can know these stories. So what about other people in your life? What about your spouse? What about your friend? What about your Christian friends? What about your pastor? What about that church over there and what's going on? Jesus says, don't worry about other people. My plans for them are not my plans for you. You follow me. God's given you, isn't this amazing? Your own calling, if you know him, if you're his son or daughter. Your responsibility is never to look to what other people are doing, but to follow him wherever you are. Do not compare yourself to anyone else. You know what happens when you can play the comparison game? You always lose in some way, because there's always someone who's somehow in our minds better. Whether it's better looking, more godly, more holy, better at serving, better at caring, better at loving, whatever it might be. Do not compare yourself. You follow Jesus in your life as he serves you, as he restores you. You follow him to what he's called you to. I'll just close with the beautiful verses that John himself gives us. This is John's whole gospel. This was his calling, and then he closes it in this, what I think is a wonderful way. Verse 24, this is the disciple who's bearing witness about these things. John says, hey, it's me. I'm writing these things. I saw this happen. And who has written these things and who we know that his testimony is true. There are many other things that Jesus did. Were every one of them to be written, I suppose the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. Let's pray. Jesus, thank you for all the things that you did. Thank you for the ways you did simple things like serving breakfast, serving brunch to your disciples. Not just so that we would have a funny story about Peter jumping out of a boat into the water, but so that we could see the bigger picture of the God who serves us, the God who sustains us, the God who loves us. And then thank you for the way that you restored Peter, so we can see an example of how you restore us. Lord, show us primarily not what our calling is, not just what am I supposed to do, what am I supposed to go, how am I supposed to be. Show us mostly your grace, your goodness, your love, your sustaining power, and then help us to follow you. Show us what that means individually for all of us. Lord, today for those in here who have not put their trust in you, I pray this would be the first day that they are able to see and call and to answer when you say, follow me. That this could be the first day they meet that God of restoring grace and love. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.